It's a wild time in Europe. So 7 years of peace dividend coming to an end quite abruptly in Ukraine. A economic recovery that has, for many countries, stagnated after 2008 and never quite picked up. A reckoning on the side of the startup world. And this was sort of a consumer-first VC and startup world that skipped the whole 60s and 70s Cold War electronic warfare-backed companies of the Bay Area and Silicon Valley. And there's a sort of a reversion to that now.
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, a podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweat, and my Second Front comrades as we dismantle the mundane and cut through the bureaucratic BS to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Ready to get weird?
What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of All Quiet on the Second Front, the podcast where boring defense talk comes to die. I am your host, Tyler Sweat, and gonna do another, which I'm pumped is sort of like an increasing trend here, where we're gonna go international and get to bring in good friends, someone I've admired their work for quite a while here, and excited to bring Eric in from the other side of the pond without the accent, so it'll be easier to understand. And talk a little bit not just about 201 and some of the work he's doing, but also what we're seeing across the European sort of dimension and what we think that means for the future of global national security. So, Eric, brother, thanks for stopping over, man.
Tyler, looking forward to it. I'm excited for this
Heck
talk.
yeah. All right, we'll pop the hood on you to get started. So, give the people what they want. Who are you? What are you up to? How'd you get here? All that.
All right, awesome. I'm Eric Slesinger. I'm out in Madrid, Spain right now. Tyler, as you said, no accent. I'm from D.C. originally, born in city proper and then raised right outside in Maryland. Background covers three things, which is increasingly common, I think, in this space, which was engineering originally. Felt like a bug for service at the time that all my buddies were going to work at Google X and build iPhones and stuff, and I was like, I want to do something a little more service oriented. That led to the intelligence community. I worked for many years as an intelligence officer, building tech and then deploying it overseas. It was fantastically fun, like exactly what every little kid's dream is. Sometimes some days you get up and you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this. And the other days you get up and you're like, wow, this bureaucracy sucks, and you want to fix it. And it was during the sort of in between on phase on one of those days where I had this realization that the future competition really is happening in the private sector in large part, and the competition is moving more towards an economic one. And I had no facility in that language. I had no faculty. I could not speak that language. Could barely even understand it. So I went out, got an MBA, did a little bit of a time during that MBA at In-Q-Tel, which you, of course, know, and I know many of your listeners know. That was circling back to the national security roots, bringing in the venture capital and the tech side. And now I'm out in Europe building 201 Ventures, and the goal for 201 is to advance freedom and autonomy in Europe. And I'll leave it there because I know we're going to dig way more into that. But if there's one thing I could try to sort of leave is to say Europe is a really important security risk that most don't have on their top three. And that's the exact reason why I'm out here.
Yeah. Love the background, right? Love the engineering to service to sort of commercial. I think there are a number of us that are either going to have an engineering or like a math or econ background to that, and it leads you right through. And I think it does become one of those things where you're going to cycle back through just because the curve is going to sort of take you where the curve is going to take you. Looking out, sort of domestically, U.S., broader domestically, Europe, a seeming time of tremendous fluidity, tremendous change. You've got, a pretty wild election happening domestically in the US. You've got a freaking war happening in Europe. And I think all of your historical sort of top three, top five European sort of mainstay leaders, like your traditional leaders, are having a ton of domestic challenge, both economically and socially. So, we'll start with sort of the big picture, but let's talk about what does that mean for the West, for us, for good versus all of that. What's your take on
Yeah,
that? The
it's a
softball
wild
question.
time. Yeah, everything's rosy out here, and it's a wild time in Europe. I mean, This is a combination of a lot of things. You just laid them out. I mean, sort of 7 years of peace dividend coming to an end quite abruptly in Ukraine. Um, a economic recovery that has, for many countries, stagnated after 2008 and never quite picked up. uh, a reckoning on the side of the startup world on not just valuations, but also on meaning on what people are building, given that in large part venture capital out here was born post internet age. I mean, this was sort of a consumer first VC and startup world that skipped the whole 60s and 70s Cold War electronic warfare backed companies of the Bay Area and Silicon Valley. And there's a sort of a reversion to that now that's happening. This, of course, is in the backdrop of the US turning towards China, of, as you said, an election, of a finally reawakening of what it means for Europeans to match on 2% for NATO. And so all of these things lead to a couple sort of big picture moves. So one is that I'll start on the startup side and then move towards government and defense side. One is that founders are really, really excited and they're seeing that they want to build something that is service oriented, oftentimes maybe even a second or third company to do something that has extremely high impact that they didn't feel that they had before in the previous companies or previous efforts. That's it's amazing to see it. Uh, Two is an understanding now that very likely Europe cannot rely on importing its defense technology for the next couple decades. I think it's like 78% was bought basically from outside the EU over the last couple years. And if you run the numbers down, that it's about a $1.6 trillion underlap on what would have been paid in had all the European countries hit their 2% target on spending. Had that happened, we would have spent $1.6 trillion more, and you can imagine how much more technology would have been developed in Europe had that happened. And then at the same time, you've got a defense industrial base that is proliferated so many systems that are so different because we've got 27 different countries and constituencies to serve. One of the really interesting stats, if you look the number of tactical fighter jets in Europe versus the US, you have 20 different platforms in Europe, 7 in the US. I mean, procuring and the R&D on those alone is crazy, and then you can imagine the maintenance and operations to sustain that. It's unsustainable.
It's a
And
Boeing
so
joke in there I'm not going to make. Everyone was
this
thinking it though.
this is finally the sort of the eyes are opening here to say, wow, this can't work. And luckily there's if you look at the budgets that are moving forward, and I'll wrap this up here, there's reason to be optimistic in Europe, at least if you're on the side of wanting to make some change here with new technology. About 700 to $800 billion over the next 4 or 5 years is going to be added to the budgets here. And so all of these things are a reason why I choose to be an investor here rather than, as we've heard from many of your guests, in the US, where there's a really rich ecosystem, amazingly mature talent pools that have gone into defense tech in the last number of years. We're a bit in earlier innings here in Europe, but it's no less quality on talent. And as you can see, that the budgets now are there to sustain it.
And I think that sort of first inning aspect of it is a really, really interesting thread to pull. And there's gonna be, a few sort of parts of this question, but I'll just deliver them in sort of bite size. So, we talk about a lot of Europe really sort of stagnating that economic recovery post 2008, juxtaposed with maybe like a historic, apathetic of sorts view towards military contributions into NATO and things like that. Now, with the rise of hey, there's maybe not to use all Harrison Ford, a clear and present danger, but like, hey, like we should probably catch up. So as you look at that from like an ecosystem and a market standpoint, what's your sort of take on there? Recognizing geopolitically, kind of early innings from a private capital standpoint into the political climate, from a more economic approach, right? What is your sense on the ground? What's the appetite of the government and the consumers and the constituents? How are you seeing that both at an economic, I guess, and a policy standpoint?
Yeah. The short version to that answer is it's looking good. And the reason I say that is if you study the budgets from some of the largest European countries, they are really seriously increasing. Then the next step, of course, is all right. Let's look at the actual appropriations. Are those budgets actually getting put towards good use, or is it a budget game that is going towards the incumbents more than anybody else? Which, you could argue for the defense of Europe is could be good, but as a startup investor, I want to see that proliferate a bit more to early stage and growth startups. Also looking good. We see founders that are able to close contracts that 5 years ago probably would have taken them 3 times, 4 times as long. Not because the tech wasn't understood, but because the mechanisms weren't in place to onboard it onto the existing or newly created vehicles. Just to kind of like lay the foundation, there's a story I wanted to tell that just sort of set the stage of how good it used to be back a couple hundred years ago in terms of the thinking on defense in Europe, and then how like sclerotic it became, and now we're like breaking free of that. So this one I just tell this story because it shows the level and depth and like timeline of thinking it used to be. So Jean-Baptiste Colbert was this minister in France, 1660s under Louis the Great, um, largely like an economic minister. But one of the things he was worried about, he created the merchant marines essentially of France, was that France did not have enough timber to build ships. He was like, man, if we keep importing from Scandinavia, they're gonna, if we ever go to war, they're gonna cut us off because they're gonna need it for themselves. He looked at England; they had enough timber for like 100. France had enough for 20. So he did this big program. He said, "All right, we're gonna plant entire forests of oak, and those forests will be ready in about 200 years." That that was the timeline of thinking. The willingness to make a massive investment for 200 years in the future.
Plant
Um,
these trees that we won't enjoy the shade of.
yes,
Yep.
and can you imagine right now if you look at the state of shipbuilding in, say, the U.S., which is needs work, or elsewhere? Can you imagine thinking and getting a bill passed in Congress that would be serving citizens of 200 years in the future? It's almost laughable.
Yeah, there's not an appetite for that. We also don't have the incentive model built for that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I'm going to talk to you about this. 2017, 18, up on the hill, trying to talk about what was coming with adversarial machine learning and deep fakes, and obfuscating different attack vectors. And the hill was effectively like, "Hey, kick rocks, nerd! Like, we don't know what you're talking about." It's like, awesome. And here
thanks.
we are. Yeah, here we are. So either A, I
So,
really wasn't good at my job, which is likely the cause, or B, like, because
so
of the cyclical nature and like the polarizing sort of accelerant that like social media and contemporary sort of social dynamics demands, the capacity for true strategic thought is being just reduced to a very small subset of the population, and more often than not the loudest ones, which I think is the part that scares me the most.
yeah, yeah. But this is where, like, I sort of believe in the nerds, right? I'm one of them. This is the
Yeah.
coda. This is where they come in on that story. By the way, the coda of that story is that, of course, wood was not the construction material of choice of the future of these vessels. Those forests now supply the barrels that age the French wine, basically, and that's basically the history of why the French cooperage industry exists and how they have such sustainable forest practices. It's crazy, right? You think you like as an investor in the space, you think you know all the stories of, oh, this was originally military technology, internet,
Yep.
GPS, blah blah blah. Uh, French oak barrels for
French wine is dual use.
it's doing
You
exactly.
heard it here first. I like that.
And,
I'm gonna steal that one.
and this is why you find those engineers that are like, all right, well, if that forest can take 200 years, we clearly need to figure something else out. And I tell this story because that shows the level of anticipatory thinking. And then fast forward to sort of post World War II. Today, Germany and France are sort of inked this really fraught agreement on a next generation battle tank, and they could barely agree on the ammunition size, 130 or 140 millimeter. Like they're arguing over 10 millimeter, which is of course a symbolic argument that has way bigger knock-on effects. It's not just just that. But that's how sort of how rigid this became. And what I want to see and what I think is finally happening because not only the war in Ukraine, not only the seeing what's happened in the US in defense tech, but really pushed by founders that are wanting to do something mission oriented is that people are breaking free of this and governments are realizing it. So um, if I were to sort of make a prognosis of where Europe is at today, it's definitely the best place it's been in decades on finally coming around to taking an approach to on its own, taking its defense into its own hands. Um, Poland right now is doing really cool stuff to obviously right on the border. If I were setting up shop, I'd definitely with a new company, I'd definitely have some folks out there. Um, and this is because there's a clear present danger. There's nothing drives it like that. A clear present danger, along with a government, and for example, in Poland, that's willing to try some new stuff and put money behind it. You know?
So as we talk about sort of the Europe being the best position it's been in decades. We opened with sort of the broader sort of global geopolitical instability. I think we alluded to some of the market, fluidity where cost of capital sort of changed a couple of different times, like relative valuations. We talk about, the policy, the welcoming sort of nature of Europe. What do you tell founders and operators now that maybe are benefiting from, and again, I'll go off the pitch book data, the third kind of consecutive year of pretty sustained defense tech capital injection. What do you tell them about Europe? Because I think there is, or there has been, maybe some too quick to expand. And you and I have oft joked that, like, one need to go no further than London to see the graveyards of, or the corpses of, a bunch of high flying sort of defense companies. How should folks think about European expansion, Europe as a whole, or country by country? Like, how do you advise that? And then, I guess, conversely as well, some of the European companies that you see, how do you talk to them about the US and how to think about that?
Yeah. I look at it a couple ways, and one, and yet that Europe being the best that it's been in decades is, it sounds super superlative, but let's remember it was not good for many decades, and so there's still a lot of work to do. Make no mistake. Um, the way I would advise a company that's maybe a U.S. company that has seen, like you said, multiple years, a couple cycles, sort of short cycles now of defense tech expansion, a little bit of contraction, maybe some expansion again. Uh, Up on Europe, what I would say to them is this: first, take like 3 buckets of how to think about Europe. 1 on sales, 2 on talent, and 3 on feedback, product feedback. Um, Outside of those 3 things, I think you have to rip a really special strategic sort of really like sharp insight you want to prove. But those 3 things I think are pretty applicable across different companies and different stages for that matter. So in reverse order on product feedback, there's a lot of folks that are going to say, okay, Ukraine is a place to be. Um, just like we've joked about that graveyard in London of shops of US companies that have come and gone, there is an equal number of products that have quote unquote been battlefield tested in Ukraine. And I think you know where I'm going with this, which is there's just a lot of swirl that's going on with those claims. And all it takes is talking to Ukrainians on the front lines and know that many of those things that were battlefield tested, yeah, they were tested and they failed and they failed and were sent home. And so I think that the common wisdom of get to Ukraine and get quick product feedback early, it can work, but there's other places here that can give really good feedback as well. And so one place that's an interesting one is Estonia, Tallinn. Right now, there's a massive electronic warfare campaign happening that's affecting the skies over Estonia and the Baltic states. On the internet, just Google Estonia jammer, I think is the term of sort of term du jour. Uh, if you're an EW company, you got to be out there. If you're an EW and not collecting those company and not collecting those signals, like what are you doing? And so I think that the most interesting founders are realizing there's these pockets of other places to collect product feedback that's not just the front lines in Ukraine. Number 2 on sales and go to market. I think the question here, of course, is where do you start? Europe being 27 front doors and 27 procurement agencies at a minimum on a good day. let alone the different organizations within each of those 27 member states, member countries. That's really hard, and so the companies I see that are most, sort of incisive about the way they think about Europe are picking in order. So it usually starts with one of the bigger economies, Germany, France, UK, for example. But again, just like those founders that are taking creative ways to get product feedback, there are really creative readings of where certain countries want to spend budget. And if you're the best, Greece right now, for example, Greece, as you know, has more coastline than most countries, given its relative to its size. And so, if you're working on something that's doing maritime perimeter security, you should look at Greece. And you might want to look at the Scandinavian countries as well, Norway or Finland or Sweden. But Greece is putting money to work here. And so I look at that also when I'm looking at it or talking to a founder to say, look, don't just think about setting up a sales shop in London. It's more than that. You really, if you want to make a real effort here and be able to sort of uh, have a snowball effect with your sales in Europe, think about places that have really specific interests, because that's the advantage that in many times can outweigh the disadvantage of not having one single front door like you get in the US. And then finally on talent, just to wrap it up, the talent here is so good. Like I live on the internet. I know the memes. I to part of me wants them to keep going because it's alpha for me investing out here. Be like, all right, you think that. Please think that Europe is slow and like no, the talent here is so good, and it's so good and so excited to work on these types of products and companies. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to come in and go to TUM in Munich, go to ETH Zurich, go up to Cambridge and Oxford in the UK, go to the areas around EPFL in France and the semiconductor sort of areas in Eindhoven and in Holland, and you will just find amazing pockets of talent that is looking for hard problems to solve.
Yeah, I mean, echo the sentiment on the talent. I think it is a massive untapped opportunity. Is trying to figure out how do we, and I mean, untapped aside, you're clearly seeing it, but how do we take a bigger sort of effort to start to fold in a line and really sort of empower that? Um, and sort of last question before we do the turn into sort of final is like, do you see things like, and I recognize this is like a little bit bigger, maybe cross sectional orthogonal to just Europe, but like things like AUKUS Pillar 2, where we're trying to remove some of the ITAR restrictions to allow for maybe more increased permeability with knowledge transfer, and software and stuff. Is that a step in the right direction for us to start finding ways to allow for increased mobility, knowledge transfer, and collaboration at that human level, kind of across Europe and our allies?
I really hope so, Tyler. Like, I was so excited to see the UK, Australia, US ITAR thing. I mean, I have to say, I was surprised. Like, I was pleasantly
Same,
surprised.
same. Yes.
I was, oh, man, this is great. Was my first reaction, and my second reaction was to Google it to really make sure it was real. I would love to see it. One of the things that I've been noodling on, and it's a piece of the thesis of the fund, is what does it take to create essentially an ITAR island? I don't mean that in the literal sense of like a place like Australia. And you can look at no further than Andorra for going there to set up something to specifically create outside of traditional ITAR restriction zones. But what does it mean to have an engineering pod in Krakow that is close to the action, close to high talent density, and then at the same time able to share the IP across borders? There's definitely some regulatory issues to figure out. There's also, legal ways of working to make sure this is all transparent. But I think the impact is huge, and it's really good for both parties. By the way, it's good for the European countries that are hosting these groups, whether that's an engineering shop that's part of take your pick of any large defense prime that sits close to the action, and it also benefits the local environment, because these research dollars proliferate, the ideas proliferate, the people then become the next founders that are working on this stuff. So I think it's amazing. I would love to see it. I haven't yet seen a clear enough example that gets me to the point where I could say, yeah, this is real in Europe. as soon as it is, I'll be the first to sort of come in and shout from the mountaintop on it because I think it's going to be a huge source of innovation, frankly.
Just such a compounding effect of things like that. That if we can get that ball rolling and get the first win or two, and just start to celebrate, to your point, like people sit around there telling other people, people are seeing it and wanting to be involved, and it just builds and it builds and it builds, and then all of a sudden it's got its own power. It no longer needs to be fed.
Yep,
And that's what we've got to be just in like relentless pursuit of for a global national security
I
standpoint.
agree. And I think that the if I weren't doing this, if I had, 10 more hours in my day every day, I'd go to ground on the details on this. There is you know this, having built a company. There's the details around this are what make it happen. Has to be the ability to, do work at NATO secret level. It has to be the ability to, ship across, it is as mundane as you think it is to make this stuff happen, but that's where the teams that are I promise the people behind those ITAR policy changes are knee deep in the details that no one else wants to worry about. No one wants to,
We
but
need to, yeah.
we need to. We really need to.
So on that, right, we've gone a whole bunch of big sort of macro geopolitical down into societal and sort of country level, talking about practical applications, practical advice for founding teams and operators around product market fit and feedback, sales and marketing, sort of talent, gone back into the how do we think about policy and transfer. So sort of last question, like, and a lot on how do we harness the good. Last question, Eric. King for a day. You're Dumbledore. You got the wand. What's the one thing that you change? You don't have to caveat like, "Hey, here's the dependencies." You wave the wand, it happens. What's the one thing you change and why?
Yeah, I would institute, and Tyler, I'm laughing because we've talked about this before, and you and I both have lived it. I want a national service program, and I think service program, I would call it something like regular service, and everyone does it for 2 years, no exceptions, none. There are accommodations to make anything work. You go work on cleaning up highways, you work on education in tribal areas, you could join the military if you want. You go figure out voting security up in Massachusetts. You go work on, trade agreements through the Strait of Gibraltar. Uh, this is something that I think would instill a service mindset in new generations that for me personally, and the reason if I were king for a day, I would just do it. For me personally, this was transformative in my not just my career, but my life. It is the underpinning of everything I've done sort of post like high school finding myself. Uh, and I think it would do a lot to renew what citizenship means for entire generations that have lost meaning, where that term has lost meaning.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan. I think it's important. Like it bears just repeating, right? That when we talk about something like this, it's not, hey, everyone's conscripted into the military for 2 years or for 4 years. It is the act of giving to something bigger than oneself. And to go back to the how French wine is a dual use technology, to planting seeds of trees one may not enjoy the shade of. And that, from an ability to mentally, emotionally, physically, all of that just builds in such a depth of character at an individual level that, to your point, Eric, it is transformative to oneself. But I think it is like a fundamental building block on which future generations and future society has to be built on. Love it. It did not need caveating, but I feel so strongly in support of it that I felt it deserved one.
Thank you. I appreciate the co-signing.
Yeah, man. Dude, this rocked. As always, it's killer to chat. Looking forward to crossing paths. I think we're like strangers in the night every now and then. So
I
we'll
will
see
see
that
you at
sweet mug in person here soon.
look forward to seeing you at Dulles. Yeah, we'll catch each other in the customs line.
Exactly. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Have a good one. Cheers.